My name is Nicolas LaLone. I'm an assistant professor over at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where I primarily concern myself with figuring out how to better integrate computer technology with emergency management. I'm one of 4 authors on this paper, From Paper to Pixels, a Chronicle of Game Map Interfaces. The primary focus of this paper has to do with the evolution of map interfaces in games. Previously we wrote about the sort of ways that game maps can afford users certain kinds of activities and what that relationship is. And what we're looking at now is, now that we've identified all these different ways that that games have done this, what's in the history of it? What has been the evolution? The thing that has occurred inside of video game spaces is that games primarily get bigger. Game worlds get bigger. None of this is collected anywhere. And another reason for us to be interested in this, again, this interdisciplinary space, is that indoor-based location services, the ability for us to take existing mapping technologies and bring them indoors, is already being performed at leisure inside of video games. You can see here as I move from the outside space to a building, the iconography changes seamlessly. I can change what things I'm looking at. I can see the names of the different places that I'm on, and I don't have to go to a separate screen. Now, to assemble this game chronicle, or this kind of chronicle of map interfaces, we looked at our experiences in games. We've all been in our late 30s, early 40s. We've been playing video games most of our lives. What is it that we've picked up along the way? We counterbalanced this with Let's Plays of games that we hadn't had a lot of experience with, or we played them ourselves. We watched playthroughs, we read blog entries about different types of maps and games, we talked to historians who were interested in figuring out how different maps and games functioned, we listened to podcasts and talked to designers themselves. We were very exhaustive in how we assembled these games. Another way to consider the sample that we created is a landscape sample. This is a sampling methodology that relies on very purposeful sampling, and we're not looking for an exhaustive sample. We're not looking for how often a certain thing appears. We are simply interested in a typography of sorts. Now, through this research, through play, through examination, through discussion, we assembled this history of game map interfaces that begins in the 1800s and ends in the present. It's still ongoing. And these are the 7 different trends that we're going to, or that we feel this is how game map interfaces have evolved. Now, I'll go through each of these with just kind of a little bit of an explanation on them, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what we've learned in the end. Now, the first sort of prehistory of game map interfaces has to do with the origin of maps interacting with players, and players interacting with maps. And that it begins with Napoleon Bonaparte and his conquest of Europe. He stole the composite of France, and this was created by the Cassini family, who sort of create this topographical techniques, and Napoleon deploys this as one of the first sort of analytics of victory. He looked at the topography of a particular battlefield that he wanted to wage on. He looked at his existing technology, and through this sort of long calculation, calculated his probability of success. He defeats the Prussians so soundly that they had no other choice but to figure out how Napoleon was doing what he was doing and how to train soldiers in doing that. And this is the creation of the war game. Over time, over the course of this 100-year history and multiple wars, we start to see players begin to play not an army general outside of the game, but as one character inside of a game world. And this is the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. This is in the 1973, 1974. This had been developing throughout the mid-1960s. And what Dungeons and Dragons provided was this sort of variable-based, map-mediated, imaginative play. Now, that variable-mediated is very important, because what ends up happening is Dungeons and Dragons appears as computers appear. As people gain access to, as enthusiasts gain access to computers themselves. And so they begin to replicate their Dungeons and Dragons experience inside of digital spaces, and this is sort of the creation of the video game industry as a whole. It moved from parlor games like table for tennis or checkers or poker, into this sort of variable-based map exploration activity. Now, text-based adventure games and games like D&D here on the Plato system, these were two different ways that Dungeons & Dragons was interpreted very early on. This is in the mid-1970s, 1975 or so. And these two games offer different interpretations, different ways to explore a map. A D&D here, this orange game, was procedurally generated. It created a random map, filled it with random things, and you as a player would have to go through and defeat these objects if you could to get the treasure at the bottom of the map. Now, over time, these games started to become incredibly complicated. We started to see games that examined worlds, games like Ultima and things like that, became so complicated, so convoluted, that a new design space was able to appear, and this is the Japanese role-playing game. Now, these games were interesting because gameplay occurred on the map itself. No longer did I have to play the game through mapping things out by myself. I could simply walk around inside of the dungeons and remember where I was. This was unheard of at the time, and it fostered a new way of playing. And this mode of playing was popular when three-dimensional games appeared. This game, Final Fantasy VII, was one of the first sort of 3D RPGs, and you can see here, you're still running around on the world map. You would enter into different three-dimensional spaces. It was still mediated by this two-dimensional map, but as time went on, the map became a whole other screen with all sorts of other details in it. I could look for where quests were, where objects were, where enemies were. And I could use this map to achieve all sorts of directed play. I could know where I should go as a player. And as a designer, I can foster this idea of where players should go. And again, we get back to how maps worked. Because what ended up happening here is that while World of Warcraft was messing around with the fantasy and its indoor-based location services and this mini-map versus the big map area, the big map screen, games like Grand Theft Auto were sort of absorbing what was happening outside of the video game world and putting it into the video game world itself. So cell phones, you can see in the lower left, this sort of Google Maps looking interface showing me where to go. So those are sort of a very rudimentary examination of our particular landscape. And what exactly is it that we learn? Sort of at the core of this, we noticed that as memory increases, the number of objects inside of the world goes up. As the number of objects go up, the number of subsystems that I need to put to maintain and catalog all of these different objects goes up. This allows and fosters more and more complex map interfaces, but the problem is that as the number of subsystems, as the number of objects go up, I start to take away from player creativity. Instead of fostering exploration with my map, I start to foster this checklist creation. I want to steal every spoon that exists in the world. So create a checklist of spoons, and that's what I'm going to do as a player. And one thing that became very clear is that in Dungeons & Dragons, the map is the play space. We are all sitting around a table looking at this map, sort of starting to understand what it is that our characters are running around in. But inside of video games, maps have become the planning space. So we see players organizing and planning on a map screen, and then they enter into the video game world itself to do everything that they had just planned on the map. So what's next for us? Well, we assembled this Chronicle. It's 123 games. We think it covers pretty much every type of game map independent of GIS-oriented play, so location-based games like Pokemon Go. What we're interested in next is are these sort of add-ons. So players can have the opportunity to create their own map interfaces. What have they been doing? And what does game mapping look like inside of Dungeons & Dragons today? There's a lot of pre-formatted maps. There's a lot of sort of retro-oriented games. And then again, inside of the emergency management space, how could we use something like a cell phone inside of an object like the game maps interfaces that exist today? So that is From Paper to Pixels, a chronicle of game map interfaces. My name is Nicolas LaLone, and if you have any questions for any of us, feel free to contact us. We're more than happy to talk about this topic some more. Thank you.